got my coffee and today's guest here with me, so we're ready to roll. Welcome to our Circular Coffee Break podcast, where we will be casually talking about everything circular and beyond. As always, we hope the podcast is interesting, insightful for you, provides new ideas and new perspectives. If you have any feedback, improvement ideas, suggestions, leave us a note on your favorite podcasting platform or drop us an email at info@taival.com. Now, I'm really excited about today's guest. She is an associate professor for supply chain management and social responsibility at Hanken School of Economics. Previously, she has been working as a researcher at VTT and Aalto University, where her research interests can be categorized in three themes. One is sustainable supply chains and circular economy. One, managing external resources and strategic sourcing. And third, data-based decision-making in procurement. She has been initiating, conducting, and managing numerous multidisciplinary research and development projects with research partners, companies, and public funding organizations such as Nordic Innovation, Business Finland, and the European Union. She's currently involved in various projects, including Urban Symbiosis, which is about urban symbiosis of critical raw materials, collaborative value creation models in circular ecosystems, funded by the Academy of Finland, and in eSmile, Innovation Sustainable Urban Last Mile, small vehicles and business models, funded by the Nordic Innovation. During her career, she has also been working as a development manager at Pöyry, and she is a board member of the Finnish Association of Purchasing and Logistics, LOGY. If all of that wouldn't be enough, her doctoral thesis that she did at Aalto University were on the role of attraction and control boundaries in value creation, dyadic exploration of strategic buyer-supplier relationships. She has published her work in several academic journals, including Research Policy, International Journal of Production Management, Journal of Purchasing and Supply Management, and many others. So I'm really, really happy to welcome today to the podcast Anna Aminoff. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's really nice to be here.
Perfect. Really looking forward to discuss with you today about sustainable supply chains, circular supply chains, a very hot topic where a lot has been happening. But maybe to get us started, you have been working in the area of sustainable and circular supply chains now for a very long time. From your point of view, what is the state of the sustainable circular supply chain? Where are we today? And where have you seen the biggest progress, but also the biggest challenges in the past couple of years?
Okay, that I think you would like to have a short answer so that we wouldn't be here for a whole day. But as you said, a lot has happened because when I started studying sustainable supply chains or green logistics, as it was called 20 years ago, I was kind of considered as a hippie, and it was really a niche and in a side stream of both research and practice. So a lot has happened, and I would say, as you mentioned, that during last 3 or 4 years, there has been a big change because nowadays, when I'm saying that I am researching sustainable supply chains, almost everybody are like, oh, or the company managers, oh, it's so interesting. We are also developing it. So it is now in the interest and in the focus of, I think, almost every single company in Finland. And also the CEOs and top managers of the companies have at least somehow understood the importance of supply chain management in sustainability. Circular economy, maybe a bit less. And also, it's quite interesting that also in a circular economy discussion, supply chains are not always in the focus although it is actually the supply chains which actually keep the materials flowing. But if we go back a bit to what has happened in the companies when we think of sustainable supply chain management, it is a lot of effort is connected or linked to CO2 emissions and scope 3 emissions, and that is where there is a strong focus in the sustainability development, and maybe the other aspects of sustainability, both the social side and also for biodiversity or circular economy, as I mentioned, are not that strongly there yet. And a lot of emphasis is also put to kind of understanding where are we now, what are our emissions from the scope 3 emissions today before actually going to the development. So it's more on a strategic and vision level than actual doing something yet, but it is the first step, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the context of a project very recently, I looked at companies like Ford, Caterpillar, Wärtsilä, and so on, and you see that they are actually starting to take the topic very seriously, and it actually is mentioned in the annual report. It is mentioned in CEO briefings. It is a topic that is looked at. At the same time, I mean, supply chain in many organizations is defined very narrowly. Supply chain is very often only the direct procurement, the direct suppliers, potentially the customers. But if you think about circularity, if you think about life cycle kind of treatment of products and services, refurbishing, end of life, and so on, you need to think about supply chain much more broadly. Basically, as a end-to-end value chain perspective with a very holistic approach, basically from the time the raw material sees the day of light to the point the product is at its end of life. Now, in my experience, this has been very difficult for companies because in many organizations, the value chain is extremely long, extremely difficult. It's global. It touches geographies, countries, and companies where it's very difficult to get information. From your experience, how can we address this need for a broader perspective and a need for transparency along the end-to-end value chain, and basically look at the end-to-end value circle, if you want, in that context? And just for the listeners, I'm aware that there is no end-to-end circle. Just to avoid emails telling me how circles work in that context.
That is a really difficult question, and your listeners couldn't see me nodding, but you were exactly kind of in one of the challenges, so that because the supply chains are long and complex, and companies have been building these so-called forward supply chains to be really, really efficient for many, many years, and it's in their DNA. So it's really difficult to change the existing supply chains to be more circular. And I was reading one research which researched how well companies know their supply chains. And it was like about 40% of the companies in general, it was worldwide, know their first tier suppliers. And 30% know their second tier suppliers. And then we are only in the second tier. So the companies don't really know their supply chains. And there are ways to map the supply chains, do the supply chain mapping, but it needs a lot of effort, and most of companies might not have resources for supply chain mapping. And it's also, but I think where it really starts is really understanding what do we know and what do we not know, and also recognizing this problem of circular economy. And you were talking about transparency, so visibility or transparency is one problem, but then the other challenge for companies is also control or influence, how much they can actually influence their suppliers, because because I think we all know that circular design is the first or one of the most important steps to circularity. But in many companies, the circular design is not in your own hands. So how can they actually control or influence to their supply chain members? But then about visibility, there might be some technological solutions coming like blockchain and so on. So we will see how they will actually influence, but it's not there yet. But I think that for companies really kind of rethinking existing supply chains, do they need to be so long and global and really kind of changing the supply chains? But changing the supply chain is not easy because they are contract bounded and so on. So that is a question, and because of the whole organization is built for forward supply chains, and procurement processes are built for taking care of the first tier suppliers, and how sustainability is also developed. It's kind of a cascading effect, putting more responsibility for the first tier suppliers to take care of the sustainability of the supply chain, and it doesn't really maybe help in circular economy business models.
Absolutely. And I mean, you spoke about the complexity and about the fact that these supply chains have been built over years, over tens of years, in many companies over hundreds of years.
Exactly.
In that context. And it's very difficult to change that from a mentality point of view, but also from a pure process point of view.
Yes, and contract point of view as well sometimes, and so on.
Yes. Now, you mentioned technology, you mentioned data as one component of that. What's your perspective on? Because I mean, you mentioned the contracts, so taking a step back a little bit. Very often, you just don't have the leverage to go down 3, 4, 5 layers in your supply chain and basically request the data of where's the raw material coming from. Or where has the product been produced, or what is the design here and there. And from that point of view, you cannot just get the data. And on the other hand, you have legislative initiatives like in Germany, but also on the EU level about supply chain transparency laws, where companies will be mandated or are mandated already to actually go very deep into their supply chain. Have you seen any best practices or any experiences how companies have addressed that paradox of needing to get the data, needing to influence their suppliers, while on the other hand, not having the contractual leverage to do that, and sometimes not even having the phone numbers and the contacts to basically contact their suppliers?
That is actually in which many companies are struggling, because you were mentioning this corporate responsibility due diligence law that is now coming, or regulation that is coming to EU, which requires bigger companies to take care of their sustainability in their supply chains. And that's where they've actually, the way that companies are doing it today is what I already mentioned a bit, is that they are delegating the responsibility to their first tier suppliers, who then are delegating to the responsibility to the next level. And it's a bit problematic in the sense that quite often the first tier suppliers don't really have capabilities to develop the sustainability of the supply chain. And it's really interesting to see how companies are actually going to do the due diligence longer in the supply chains when they really don't have visibility or control, because they don't have a control. But there are some best practices which are like, quite often it's in the procurement. It can be either in procurement organization or in the CSR sustainability part of the company. But what are the best practices is that companies, the procurement of the focal company would have more interaction with the procurement of the suppliers, who are then, because those are then responsible of delegating the sustainability and circularity aspects further. And it's in general, it's more collaboration in different levels and collaboration with the different functions between companies, which are one of the best practices. But the challenge is if the supplier is in less developed country and might struggle with sustainability aspect themselves, how can they control the sustainability of their suppliers if they also struggle with the sustainability aspects themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it will become a scope question as well, isn't it? I mean,
yes.
I recently had a discussion with a company, and what they're seeing is that their customers are requesting a very high degree of recycled material content in their products and services. At the same time, what they realize is there is not recycled content. So in this case, it's aluminium, and the recycled aluminium market is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
So what this company is now considering is if they actually need to either integrate into the recycling market, or if they basically need to create business models with their customers that enable them to get back the aluminium content at a later stage. So the supply chain actually becomes much, or the topic of supply, of procurement becomes much, much broader than it has been in the past. Because it's not just one company I go to and say, I buy this product, or I buy this component, or I buy this raw material, but it's basically thinking about business models, thinking about how do I interact with my suppliers, but also with other partners to get back recycled material, recycled components, and all of that. So I think it adds several levels of complexity into the picture.
It adds several levels of complexity especially into the procurement, and in many companies, procurement organizations are not used to work with this kind of a context. And that is true that the markets of many recycled materials are not. The secondary markets are not there yet, or at least in the level that it would be required. But I think that EU's many legislations, regulations that are coming might force to that direction. Also, if we think of batteries and so on.
Absolutely. A follow-up question to that: How do you see the role, the responsibility of different stakeholders? You mentioned the legislation, there's naturally the companies along the value chain, but there's also us as consumers or as buyers of products and services. And interestingly, I'm not sure if you've been following this, but in Germany, one of the big supermarket chains, Penny, has actually started an initiative where they, for 9 of their products, for I don't know what duration, they're actually giving the real prices. So what they've done is...
I saw it in the news, but I haven't followed it.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, because what they're saying is this cheese normally costs 99 cents, but if we take into consideration all the environmental, sustainability, and all the other impacts, dear customer, we will now charge you €8.50. And that naturally comes back to the consumers in that context, if they're willing to pay for a sustainable circular supply chain, because that might also require higher cost or higher prices in that context. How do you see the role of the different stakeholders in that context?
It's not an easy question. But shortly, all the different stakeholders are needed for this change, and also for us consumers, we really need to kind of course, consider how we actually use or consume products, and quite often, I think, especially in Finland, we are not the best one in recycling. That has been in the news, and also for products and materials to circle, consumers are in the center of this circle, but also companies would really need to develop business models that would nudge us as consumers to do so. But also I think legislation is needed, because virgin raw materials are still too cheap.
That's true.
So that and the EU is doing a lot on that. So that is always a bit of a trade-off, how much regulations versus business model versus consumers' effort is needed. But we have been doing some studies in sustainability in general, but also in circular economy. And a bit of an result was that everybody were thinking that somebody else is responsible of it. And then if they do it first, then we do it. So it was a bit of, so there is, and that's not really the start. But what is, I think, in circular economy, collaboration between different stakeholders is one of the keys. And what you were saying earlier is like supply chains become more like circular ecosystems than traditional supply chains.
I fully agree. Now, we hear a lot about critical raw materials, and specifically over the past months and years, we saw a lot of disruptions in supply chains, specifically when it comes to critical raw materials. You recently organized a seminar at Hanken in cooperation with VTT and Syke, the Finnish Environmental Institute, exactly on circular economy of critical raw materials. Given the high demand, but also and you mentioned global supply chains being problematic at times and in different areas, urban mining comes to mind and circularity in order to make sure that we don't use only virgin materials, but that we can actually use the recycled materials that are already in Europe, in Finland, in Germany, in the places that they are required. How do you see that development, and do you have any findings from the seminar that you could share with the listeners?
Yeah, so we have been studying a few. So we have this project which is called Urban Symbiosis, and it's funded by Academy of Finland, and we are focusing on the business model and consumer side of and supply chain management side of this problem. There are other projects that are looking for more from the technological perspective, but what we found out that there's surprisingly a lot to do. Most of the effort is focusing on e-vehicle batteries, EV batteries. And we have been researching smaller batteries like e-bike batteries. And the circular economy is not there yet. There is too little gobalt for recycling to be really profitable business. So that's why it's not really, the recycling is not there. There are problems with the recycling because of it's not that profitable because of the low level of cobalt, and then also the reuse of the batteries is problematic and so on. Even that there is this extended producer responsibility which is working, but we were quite surprised how little actually circular economy and critical raw materials are actually researched in general. From a bit more holistic perspective than only technological perspective. And there is a lot to do because many of the materials are really critical and come from as you said, there has been disruptions and might be problematic in many ways. And we have a lot of materials here in Finland, and there are a lot of, and Europe, and we should really kind of develop the ecosystem, how to recover and reuse the different materials. But EU legislation is coming. EU is doing also a lot on that.
Yeah, it's interesting to some extent, maybe surprising, and we discussed that also in earlier podcasts. How the legislator, how the EU is really taking a very active role, and is in many areas really on the forefront of putting things forward, which is something we haven't necessarily seen in the past. So it's really great to see that.
And it's also, it might be needed because, I mean, now if the value of material is low, then it doesn't really have a business case in recycling or reusing. So when EU is first maybe pushing it forward, then actually also the markets develop. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem now that there aren't any markets and there's maybe some demand and the prices are still too low for the virgin raw material. But EU is, I think it might be needed when we talk about critical raw materials that this kind of battery legislation is now coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we talked a bit already about the role of the procurement and the logistics and the sourcing side. Now, you're a board member of LOGU, the Finnish Association of Purchasing and Logistics. And I mean, procurement very often is the gatekeeper in these roles. At the same time, it's, as we discussed, very difficult for them sometimes to see the big picture and take into consideration all of these different moving parts. How do you see the role of procurement, of logistics, of sourcing will change or has to change going forward? What's the evolution you're seeing in that context when you look at the procurement professionals and how they could contribute to that shift? And as you said, there's a lot that needs to be done, so there's a lot to be contributed.
First of all, I think it's the way for the future that procurement as an organization is more involved in the circular economy business models. We are not there yet, but we were doing some focus groups with LOGU, with the purchasing managers, and we were asking about what are the future capabilities that procurement people need, and circular economy capabilities and know-how was one of them. And then I also think that what we haven't mentioned yet is the role of public procurement in circular economy. So I think kind of it's a bit of a almost low-hanging fruit in the transition towards circular economy, so that public procurement could take a bit stronger role in driving the circular solutions. But in general, also procurement could have a role as a connector between different external stakeholders and internal stakeholders, which they are not taking maybe yet. And also because, I mean, they are the ones who select suppliers, who should be connecting the product development of the suppliers to the product development maybe of the company. So they should have a stronger role in circular economy, but their role is also changing there, as you also mentioned, that it might be a bit different context. That is their playground in the future. It's also interesting that it hasn't really been researched. Circular procurement is really, I mean, there are only a few research on that topic.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it relates back to something you said earlier, the shift from a circular supply chain more towards a circular supply ecosystem.
Exactly.
Where it's not a chain in the traditional sense anymore, but where it really becomes an ecosystem. And then, as you just pointed out, it's about connecting the right dots. It's about bringing the right people, right organizations to the table, independent where they sit along this traditional supply chain. So,
and procurement has many years only kind of, procurement is still in many companies measured by the cost savings.
Yes.
And in this case, it's more like collaboration and win-win business models. So it's also a culture change in procurement and supply chain management.
Yeah, fully agree. Great. The coffee is empty, and it's time to wrap up this episode of the Circular Coffee Break. Maybe in closing, Hanken is organizing a lot of seminars, lectures, and events on the topic of sustainability and circularity in supply chain, but also beyond that. Do you have any tips for our listeners how they could learn about upcoming events, upcoming learning opportunities to dive deeper into the topic?
Yes, we have under the subject of supply chain and social responsibility, we have a Humlog Institute who is quite active in social media, LinkedIn and Twitter, and they inform and disseminate all of our events via Humlog, LinkedIn and Twitter accounts.
Okay, perfect. So to all of you out there, head over to the Twitter accounts and the social media accounts of Humlog, and then you will be up to date on everything that's happening. Thanks a lot, Anna, for joining me today. Really insightful, and I could continue for another half hour easily on the topic, because it's a very interesting topic and an area that is basically one of the key enablers of circularity in organizations, but also in society, to basically make sure our supply chains become sustainably circular in this context. So thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Perfect. So, all of you out there listening, I hope you liked today's episode and you got some new ideas, inspirations, and ideas. And Anna mentioned where you can find even more information going forward. As I mentioned in the beginning, if you have any comments, ideas, suggestions, please leave a comment or a note on your favorite podcasting platform, or send us an email to info@taiva.com. We're always looking for your input, for your ideas. How did you like the topics? Are there any things we should dive into deeper? Also, please remember to subscribe to stay in the loop on new episodes. We have new episodes coming up on a bi-weekly basis with a lot of interesting guests. So make sure you subscribe again on your favorite podcasting platform. I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you at the Circular Coffee Break. Thanks for joining.